Hey, good morning. Pretty exciting week for me. My team made it to playoffs, and we made it through playoffs to the championship game. So this last Tuesday, we had our championship game, and we lost. Kind of a bummer, but every time playoff hockey comes around, or playoff, I'm sure this is the same with basketball or baseball or whatever, but when you get to like the playoffs, when there's more on the line, there's a total shift in tone. Like it's like a different game. And I totally noticed that this last time as we were playing, that the intensity is up, the physicality is up, and it makes sense because the stakes are higher. And we're going to step into this part of the passage today in Mark, where Jesus is going to kind of begin the shift from the regular season to the playoffs, where there's going to be more intensity, there's going to be more at stake. It's going to get a lot more. It's going to get a lot more dangerous for Jesus. And there's a palpable. You can feel it and you can see it. And so we're gonna see what Jesus does before this shift, though, because before things are about to get crazy, before Jesus is about to raise the temperature in his ministry, he's going to pull the disciples aside and have a conversation with them. And he's going to kind of prepare them for how crazy things are about to be, because things are going to be different. And that's saying something, because Jesus has already been doing some pretty crazy things. Jesus has walked on water. Jesus has miraculously fed thousands of people. He's healed people that were possessed by demons. He took a little girl who was dead and raised her to life. And so the fact that the temperature is going to increase, the fact that the stakes are going to be raised, that's saying something, because things have already been pretty intense. But we're going to see this major shift take place here in the Gospel of Mark, this major boundary that Jesus, like a red line that Jesus is going to cross, that's really going to change everything for him and his disciples. And really it's a point of no return. And so Jesus knows this is coming, and he knows the disciples aren't ready. And so he's going to take them and he's going to have a conversation with them. Now, two things have been keeping the temperature down on Jesus' ministry, kind of keeping him safe. And they revolve around his identity and his location. I want to put a map up really quick. Darren, can we get that map, the map of Israel? Perfect. So there's a body of water at the top of this. I don't know if you can see this way up here. I'm on the wrong side. So right up here, right there, that's the Sea of Galilee. And so that is where Jesus has been doing the majority of his ministry, in that area. And this is kind of like the countryside. So if we want to think in terms of California, like that is like Barstow, okay? And then down here, this is like Jerusalem. So like think of LA. So you have like the city, kind of like the hub, and then you have, like Barstow. And so Jesus is out kind of on the other side of everything. It's not as populated. It's not as important in the eyes of the LA elites or the Jerusalem elites. And so Jesus is out there doing his ministry all around the Sea of Galilee. And this is modern day Lake Tiberias. It's still called the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus is up there, and one thing that kind of keeps him safe is he's staying away from Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, that's where all the movers and the shakers are. That's where the big, powerful people are. And so the fact that Jesus, he's doing powerful things, he's making a big stir, but the fact that he's kind of staying in the countryside has kind of insulated him from people who really want to kill him and have the ability to do so. Another thing that's keeping him safe is his identity. His identity has up until this point remained a complete secret. Nobody knows who he is. And so Jesus is doing crazy things, but people keep saying, like, who are you? Who is this guy? And every time Jesus does something wild, like raising a girl from death to life, he tells the people, hey, I want you to keep this a secret. And he continues to tell the disciples, like, don't tell anyone what you just saw. And part of this is because he wants to keep the temperature down, because he knows that once he crosses these two lines, that everything's going to be changing and there's no turning back. And so if we can put that map back up one more time, Darren. Jesus is about to take his disciples to this place called Caesarea Philippi, which so eventually he's going to go down to Jerusalem, and that's going to raise the temperature, and he knows that's going to happen. And eventually he's going to reveal his identity, and that's going to raise the temperature, and he knows that's going to happen. But before he does that, he's actually going to go to the north. Oh, look at this. So he's going to go right here. So this is like Caesarea Philippi, and I just thought of that in the spot. So he's going to go up to the north to this place called Caesarea Philippi. And can we put the next picture up, Darren? So this is a picture of Caesarea Philippi. It's down here. Now, there's not much left today down here. And today, if you go there, it's all ruins. But the reason I like this picture is because it shows us something else. You can see it's at the foot of Mount Hermon. And so there's a snow-capped peak. It kind of gets lost and washed out in the white at the top. But that is a mountain up at the top of the screen, and that's called Mount Hermon. And there's usually snow up there. It's the tallest mountain in the area. So Jesus takes them to this mountain, to the foot of this mountain, to this place called Caesarea Philippi. So now, let's jump into the passage. Chapter 8, verse 27. It says this: Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So again, this is the part of Jesus' identity that is very important and that is very dangerous. Jesus is the Messiah. And it's important to understand the context, the location of where he's having this conversation. Here at this place called Caesarea Philippi, there were temples built into the rock face. I want to show one last picture of Caesarea Philippi. So this is kind of like an aerial view. And so you can see this cliff at the top of the image. That cliff goes all the way up. It goes up pretty high. And then to the left, you see this little, like this cave. That's known as the Grotto of Pan. They had this temple built around the mouth of that cave. This was also known as the Gates of Hell. A lot of scholars believe that this was called the Gates of Hell, which is very significant when you take into account what Jesus says in the other gospel accounts when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and what he says to Peter. But you have the Grotto of Pan, which was this spring. The headwaters of the Jordan River would come from here. And then you have these other temples. You can see the ruins, the foundations of these temples over here. And then what you can't see is just out of shot on this other side. Today there's ruins of a palace. And so the Jewish leaders were building a palace in Caesarea Philippi. And what's so unique about this place is you have all these competing powers. You have a temple honoring the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, and kind of this as a deity, as a god, worshiping the Roman emperor. You have temples dedicated towards Pan and then other Greek mythological gods and beings. And so you have all these people saying, all right, this person has power. This person has my obedience. I'm going to worship this. And all of these different people in this area are all begging for people's authority, saying, I'm in charge, worship and follow me. And in the midst of this, Jesus says, who do people say I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And what Jesus does is he confirms his identity as the Messiah just to the disciples. And in the midst of all these other things that are saying, I'm in charge, bow down and worship to me, Jesus says, I'm in charge, bow down and worship me. And he's placing all of these other things below him. But again, in declaring himself Messiah, this is a very dangerous thing. Because to be a Messiah, the Jewish people, they get this idea of a Messiah from the Old Testament. There was this promise made to David and to Solomon that David's offspring, that someone in David's line would be raised up as a ruler and establish Israel back to its former glory, and then establish Israel above all the other nations. And they had these Old Testament passages and these Old Testament promises from God, and God added on later on while they're in exile. And he kind of re-upped that promise that from David's line, God will send a king who will restore Israel to its former glory and then some, to the point where Israel will be the greatest nation on earth, and it will be this everlasting kingdom. And so through these prophecies, the Israelites come up with this idea of a Messiah, of God sending someone to rule and really establish an everlasting kingdom that will rule the world. But this is a very dangerous term, because if anyone says, I am the Messiah, what they're doing is they're saying all other forms of leadership are going to bow down to me. And people in power don't like being told that they're not going to be in power anymore. The last time someone talked about a Messiah in Scripture, the king of the Jews, Herod, got very upset. And if you know what happens, he sends people to the town where he believes the Messiah was born and has them murder every infant in that town. That's how big of a deal it is to claim that you are the Messiah. It's very dangerous. Jesus is the Messiah, and so he informs the disciples so much. But pretty soon, other people are going to start to realize he's the Messiah. And this is going to put him in danger, and this is going to be the point of no return for him. And so again, before he does that, he wants to have a conversation with his disciples. He wants to tell them first, hey, I need to warn you, I am the Messiah. And later on, we're going to see him show them what it means that he's the Messiah. But before he does that, he has this conversation with them. He says, yes, I am the Messiah. And the disciples at first, understandably, are actually really excited. They're not afraid because even though they know this is a dangerous claim, even though they know that Jesus being the Messiah means that people are going to want to kill him, they just saw Jesus walk on water. They just saw Jesus raise people from death to life. And so in the back of their minds, they might be thinking, well, I'm in danger. I could be killed for this. But this is Jesus. And even if I die, Jesus is just going to raise me back to life. And so they're thinking, obviously it's a scary and dangerous thing, but when you watch Jesus walk on water and calm storms and raise people from death to life, I mean, he can do anything. And so they're excited. The disciples hear this and they're like, yes, because they're in the inner circle. When you're the inner circle with someone like the king, especially the king of all kings, that's a good thing for you. They're kind of thinking in terms of like right here and right now, and they're probably thinking like, man, I'm going to be able to afford that house in the mountains I've always been looking at, and they're probably thinking of all the good things this is going to be for them. But Jesus has some caution for them. He says this in Mark 8:31. He then began to teach them. So this is just after he gives them really, really good news, saying, hey guys, I'm the king, and you guys are my inner circle. He then says this. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Mark, the author here, makes a point to say that Jesus was speaking plainly. Because so far Jesus has been talking in a lot of parables and a lot of riddles and a lot of stories and analogies. And honestly, like if you ever read the Gospels, like it's confusing. Much of what Jesus says, much of what he's communicating, it's hard to understand. No matter how many times you read it, you're like, Jesus, what are you really saying here? But here, Jesus is not mincing words. He's being very clear and very direct. And he's saying to them, I am going to die. He's saying, when I reveal my identity, and when I go to Jerusalem, when I cross those two red lines, that's going to be it for the people in power. They will be fed up and they will now kill me. And he tells them they're going to succeed. They will kill me. Now Peter hears this and he says, no, this can't be possible. This isn't right. And it doesn't make sense, right? In Peter's defense, it doesn't make sense for Jesus to die. Because if Jesus is going to be placed in power and if Jesus is really going to make a difference, he can't do it if he loses. Peter has this idea of what the Messiah is going to look like, of what it means for Jesus to be king. And Jesus is now saying, hey, you have this idea of the Messiah, but it doesn't line up with the reality of my mission. And this is tough because Peter, I don't think Peter is necessarily wrong or malicious here. Peter has seen Jesus in action. Peter knows Jesus is a good guy. And not just a good guy, but like the good guy. There are a lot of people in power who shouldn't be in power. There are a lot of people who are greedy and money hungry and violent. But then you have Jesus. If there is anyone who can fix things, who can make things better, if there's anyone that should be in office, it's Jesus. A purely good man through and through. And so Jesus is thinking in terms of like we can really turn Jerusalem and Israel around. And if Jesus becomes this everlasting king, if Jesus is king of the world, he's going to make all the right calls. Like Jesus can see things that we can't see. He has a good heart. He wants what's actually good. He's not in it for selfish ambition and personal glory. Like he cares and he loves. So Jesus should be a good king. He will be a good king. But now he's saying, hey, I'm going to try to be king and then they're going to kill me and I'm going to let it happen. Peter's like, that doesn't make sense. And oftentimes we will bring ourselves into this where we have this idea of what our life should look like and where our life should be heading. We have a direction. We have this image of what Jesus should be doing with us, in us, and through us. And when I get to a passage like this, I'm reminded that oftentimes we're wrong. And I really want to challenge you to take the direction you have for your life. And Peter's direction wasn't necessarily evil. At least he doesn't think it is. He thinks like this will be good for Jerusalem, that Jesus will be the leader. That Jesus will be a king in a traditional sense of the word. And Jesus would be a good king. But Peter's wrong, and oftentimes we have this idea of like, all right, God, I think I want to go this direction. I think you want this for my life. And we paint this picture of what our lives should look like and where we'd like to be headed. God, I'd like to have this position. I'd like to be promoted to this position. God, I'd like to live in this area. I'd like my kids to be involved in these things. And we kind of have this direction that we lay out for our lives. And oftentimes, we say, all right, I think this lines up with Scripture. I think this lines up with what God wants. But oftentimes, because we're short-sighted, we're limited in what we can see, even with the best intentions, we're wrong. 5 years ago, I had an idea of where my life was going. And I thought, all right, this is where God is leading me. This is where God has me. I was working at a church in Brea. My dad was the lead pastor. I'd been there my whole life. And I had this beautiful picture in my head. I'm going to keep working here. And then one day, I'll rise up. And one day I'll co-lead with my dad. And then maybe I'll be ready to be the pastor, the lead pastor of this church. And I had this idea. And I was excited. And it was going to be good. And I don't think it was wrong or evil. But I couldn't see. I couldn't see that God had something different. And this is often the case where we have a plan and it's good, but God has something different. And we need to hold our dreams and our plans and our kingdom loosely, because oftentimes they're different from what God has in store. Jesus continues this conversation. And in 8:33, he says this, "But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. 'Get behind me, Satan,' he said. 'You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns.'" So we see that Peter's agenda is different than Jesus' agenda. Peter can't see what Jesus can see, and so he's missing things. Now, Jesus is pretty harsh with Peter here. And part of this is because this is the same exact temptation that Satan tempts Jesus with after his baptism. After Jesus gets baptized, one of the things Satan says is, "Hey, I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth." And again, for a guy like Jesus, that has to be appealing, because Jesus knows he's a better ruler than all the rulers that are in power. Jesus knows he's a good person. Jesus knows he can make a difference in all of the countries and in all the world. But that's short-sighted. Even though it would be good and effective, it's short-sighted because Jesus knows that he's here to address a different issue. There's a deeper issue than the political ones that we see. There's a sin issue that first needs to be addressed, and that's what Jesus is going to do. But it's going to require a different approach and a different method. It's going to require him to die. But this is not what Peter wants. Peter's agenda is different than Jesus's, and we see them clash. And when we hold on to our agenda above Jesus's, even if it's a good agenda, we take the role of Satan. And that's why Jesus is so stern with Peter, saying, look, we're not here to build your kingdom and to do your will. We're here to build my kingdom and to do my will. So again, it's important that we hold our plans, even if they're good, even if we have the right intentions, it's important that we hold our plans loosely, because God can see more than us. There's this pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I got a picture of him. He was active in the 1930s, and he was in Germany when Hitler was rising to power. And a lot of people don't know this, but when Hitler was elected to chancellor, one of his first battlegrounds was the church. This was kind of his area of focus, because he knew that the majority of Germans were Christians. He knew that the majority of Germans went to church, and there was a very hierarchical structure in the German church at the time. And what he did was he called these elections in the German church. And he called these elections to re-elect people in power. And really what he was doing was trying to get the church to line up with what he was doing. And he was succeeding. Whether it was through money or whether it was through promising positions of power in the church, he got his people elected to the positions that he wanted them high up in the church. And so a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer and then a number of other Christians said, we're looking at what was happening. And this was before things were really bad. Hitler was always a bad guy, but he was hiding for a while. And Dietrich, he could see that this was going a bad direction. He could see that Hitler was not following God's kingdom and God's plan. He was co-opting the gospel and God's plan into fitting his political agenda. Dietrich Bonhoeffer could see that, and a few other Christians could see this. And so they rose up and went to combat everything Hitler was doing in the church. And again, it just started off in the church. He wasn't as interested in politics. He was really just looking at how the church was being influenced by politics and say, well, we need to fix this. And after a few different battles here and there on different issues that he was making in the church, ultimately, he puts this thing down called the Barmen Declaration. Him and then a few other prominent German theologians. And they put together this Barmen Declaration, and his desire is to fix the church of the political influence and the political corruption that it was experiencing. And in the Barmen Declaration, the main thing that he says a lot of stuff, but the main thing in the Barmen Declaration is this statement that says, Jesus Christ is the head of the church, not the Führer. Which, like, duh. Like, you'd think that, like, do you really have to write that down on paper? But here's what's astounding. They put out the Barmen Declaration, and they're looking for pastors to find common ground here. They're looking for the major church leaders to say, okay, here's where we can at least start. Christ is the head of the church. And he fails to get the majority of the leaders to sign this declaration. They won't do it. How does it get to a point where something as simple as that statement, something saying Jesus is the head of the church, not the president, how does it get to a point where the majority of Christians are willing to push back against that? What would it take for you to be like, no, I'm not going to sign that? It's crazy that happened. But this isn't the first time that the gospel has been co-opted by someone with their own agenda. We talk about being the head of the church. If you're familiar with Henry VIII in England, he did a very similar thing. He kind of created his own new church. He placed himself at the head of church because he had an agenda, and the church's agenda didn't line up with his, and so he kind of made his own new thing. And we see this all throughout history, where people will have their agenda, and when it doesn't line up with the church's agenda, then they will take Christianity and bend it to their will. And certainly today this is happening. We could talk a lot about Christian nationalism. But where it really gets practical is when we get personal. Because it happens on a broad level all the time, and it will continue to happen. People will continue to try and bend the gospel to their will, to fit their agenda on a large scale. But most significantly is how might you and I be doing it on a small scale in our lives? How might we be co-opting the gospel to fit our agenda? And again, oftentimes it's not often as sinister as a Holocaust. Oftentimes it's like, well, this is kind of where I want to go with my life. And so we bring Jesus along with us instead of stopping and saying, God, what is your agenda here? And how could I bend my will to yours? But that's difficult because that requires an immense amount of sacrifice. Jesus explains this in more detail. In verse 34, he continues this and he says, Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels. So Jesus makes it very clear to the disciples and to us that saying, hey, when you follow me, when you become a Christian, you are going to take your agenda, your dreams, your hopes for the future, and you're going to put all of that second. All of it. He says, we need to seek first my kingdom. Anyone who follows me is going to take up their cross. And he uses this death language, partially because the disciples, in following Jesus and continuing on with his mission, they will die. But he also uses this death language as really he has this tone of finality of like, hey, everything that you were trying to be, you need to really let it go. You need to put all of your hopes and dreams and say, I'm first going to seek God's kingdom. I'm going to place his agenda at the top of my list, and then we'll see what happens. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was really discouraged when he put out this Barmen Declaration, and when he saw that the majority of Christians in Germany were following along with everything that the Nazi Party was doing. He was frustrated and discouraged. And he had to make a choice because now he was an enemy of the state. He was an enemy of Hitler, and he's on Hitler's list now. He knows if he stays, he's probably going to die. And so he has to make a choice. Do I go? And he actually got a job offer in England. Or no, it was in the United States. He got a job offer to go to the United States and work in New York. He had been there before. He knew some people there. And he was going to make a lot of money. He was going to have this prestigious position. He survived Nazi Germany. He had a really good trajectory. And so in contemplating what he was going to do, he decided, you know what, it makes sense. I tried here in Germany. No one's listening. The only thing I'm getting is death threats. And so he decides he's going to go back to New York. And so he goes to the United States, and he begins teaching and lecturing. And he doesn't last 2 weeks. Because deep down he knows that God has called him to stay, and he had run away. And it doesn't make sense, though, to him. He says, God, I can do more good here. I'm a lot more useful to you, alive and breathing and teaching and writing books. But God, you're calling me to go back to Germany. So he goes back. And he begins an underground seminary, and it lasts for a few years, and then eventually he's caught and he's killed. In the midst of him being back in Germany, he writes this book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in The Cost of Discipleship, he's really wrestling with what he sees in England and America and their version of Christianity, and then what he sees being lived out in his underground seminary in Germany. And he coins this term in the book, The Cost of Discipleship, called cheap grace. And as he's talking about cheap grace, he's talking about there's so many Christians who don't understand the costliness of the cross. Not only that it cost Jesus, but that it should cost us. Now, grace is free, and he makes this point to reaffirm this concept that grace is freely given. It's a gift for all of us, but it's not cheap. And oftentimes the way we treat grace is that we cheapen it. It's kind of this worthless, meaningless thing. Like, I'll take it when I need it, but I'm not going to live with it, and I'm not really going to use it. Cheap grace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, in this book, The Cost of Discipleship, is really trying to teach us that there's a weightiness to our life as believers, and it requires sacrifice. You and I are called to take our kingdom and our agenda and our plans and place them second at all times. And oftentimes it won't make sense. Oftentimes we will look at the trajectory that we've set up. We said, this seems good and this makes sense. But then God will call us to do something, and it's not going to make sense with our schedules. It's not going to make sense when we're thinking about prioritizing our families. It's not going to make sense with our finances. It's not going to make sense with our trajectory in our career. But God can see farther than us. And oftentimes when God calls us to make an adjustment, it's going to cost us in the short term. It's not going to be good for us in the short term. It's going to negatively impact our family or our finances or our career. And that causes us to say, well, Jesus, we shouldn't do that. Very similar to Peter saying, no, Jesus, don't go and die. That's going to cost us. But Jesus is saying, I can see farther. And yes, it's going to hurt in the short term. Yes, it doesn't make sense. You don't know where it's going to lead. You can't see that, I know. But I need you to trust me. And then we have this moment. So I showed that picture of Caesarea Philippi, and it's at the foot of Mount Hermon. And there's not consensus on where this next part of the passage takes place, but people believe it was either on Mount Tabor or Mount Hermon. And because of the way it's written out in Mark and a few other things, I believe it happened here on Mount Hermon. And so Jesus, if it happened on Mount Hermon, right after this in Caesarea Philippi, takes a group of his disciples up the rest of the way. So at the base of the mountain in Caesarea Philippi, and he says, come follow me, I want to show you something. And so he takes them up the rest of the mountain. And then we have chapter 9. And it says this. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before him. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before him Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Jesus knows that the temperature is about to get really hot for the disciples and for him. He knows that they're about to cross this line and enter this point of no return. And he knows that what he's doing, the Messiah that he is not lining up with the Messiah that they expect or want. And this is scary for the disciples. It's discouraging. to the point where he's concerned that they need a little more. And he knows us. He knows that sometimes we need a little more comfort, a little more encouragement, a little more direction. And so he brings them up onto this mountain, to the top of this mountain. And he says, look, I've told you what it means that I'm the Messiah, but now I'm going to show you. And he reveals himself in an undeniable way to the disciples. I'm going to invite the band up, and we're going to close. And we're going to do what we've kind of been doing these last few weeks. We took a song off of the front, and we're putting it on the back. And so we have an extended time of worship here, doing 2 songs instead of 1. And in this time, I want to encourage you, and we're gonna again really focus on allowing God's presence to encounter us in ways that encourage us, in ways that spur us on, because God is calling us all to take up our cross. God is calling us all to take the things that are most dear to us, our hopes, our dreams, our vision for the future, our family, our finances. God is calling us to look at all of this and place it at Jesus' feet. To the point where when God says, hey, I want you to go this direction, that we are willing to say, okay, it's going to cost me in these areas, but yes, Lord, I will follow you. And that's scary. And Jesus knows that. And so he often wants to reveal himself to us in a way that encourages us and spurs us on. So in this time of worship, I want you to take those things that God may be calling you into. And maybe you've been saying no for a little while. Maybe God has been saying, hey, I want you to do this. I want you to talk to this person, or I want you to have this conversation at work. Or I want you to make this adjustment with the direction that you're taking your family. I want you to make this adjustment with the direction you're taking your career. And maybe God has been nudging you and prodding you. And maybe you've been resistant because you know what it's going to cost you in the short term, and you don't know where it's going to lead to in the long term. But in this time, I want to challenge you to really place your faith in Jesus. Abraham, when he's called, he has to go up this mountain, and God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. This is the most important thing to him. And this was the only tangible part of God's promise that Abraham had at the time. God had promised Abraham a great many descendants and a whole nation that would come from him. And then he says, the one foundational part of that nation is your one and only son, and I want you to sacrifice that. And this is what God calls us to. Now, in the end, God allows Abraham to keep Isaac alive, and it was a test. But this is a test we all face. What is God calling you to? The building block today is faith, and faith requires sacrifice. But sacrifice is scary. And so I'm going to pray now. I'm going to pray, and we're going to jump into the last 2 songs, and I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to invite God's presence here. Not that God needs an invitation, but I'm going to invite God's presence here to encounter each of us. And I'm also going to pray that we get clarity as we respond in worship, that we get clarity and encouragement to live sacrificially for his kingdom. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for the work that you're doing in our lives. God, we thank you for your grace that you freely give us. But we know that grace wasn't cheap, God. We know that it cost you. And God, we know that you call us to live a life of sacrifice. Lord, I pray, encourage us and strengthen us. Reveal yourself to us. God, allow us into a mountaintop experience in your presence in a tangible and a powerful way, God, so that we may be encouraged to live the life you're calling us to live, God, so that we can hold on to this interaction, so that we can hold on to the power of your presence, knowing, God, that we can't see all the way into the future, but we can see the next step. God, strengthen and encourage us. Help us not to live a life of fear of what it might cost us, but God, a life of hope and joy, knowing that whatever it costs us, it will be worth it for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of your glory, and for the sake of those around us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.